Hello, and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and with video here on YouTube. Hey, everybody. We are here for another Rock'em Sock'em episode, and this week I join back Jon Atack. Hey, Jon, welcome back to the show.
Hey, always a pleasure, Chris. Always a pleasure.
Big time. We are recording this today on David Miscavige's 60th birthday. Now, this will probably post in a week or so, but this is the day we're recording this on. And I also just the other day did an interview with Mark Bunker. And the reason that this show is occurring is because I got to thinking about two kind of difficult, weighty topics that I thought maybe were worthy of discussion. And I thought that there is no better person I would rather talk about these with, seriously, than Jon Atack. So this was kind of on my mind all night last night, actually. And that is the subject of redemption and the subject of forgiveness, right? And also the other R word, revenge. Which also fits into this, because sort of the other side of the coin. So I thought I might bring this topic up because it's one that we haven't really directly talked about and is not often discussed in the cult world or certainly in the Scientology world. There's all kinds of talk about how we were wronged, what happened to us, what the organization does as a whole, as an entity. The David Miscavige himself, L. Ron Hubbard, right? These narcissistic bad guys, and they are. All of that talk is very, very valid talk.
Yeah.
So now we get into this new thing, and like I said, I wanted to sort of consult with Jon on this because you are definitely one of the most well-read people I know, and also have thought these things through. I find myself playing catch-up with you in many ways. Over the years as to things you've already gone through or covered or looked into or gone down the rabbit holes of. So I thought this might be something we should talk about. Specifically, to finish framing this, my interview with Mark Bunker, which, if this all goes according to plan, should have been posted a week ago. He talked specifically about the Lisa McPherson Trust and when he was involved in that. And that was a little operation set up in Clearwater right on Flagg's doorstep in the year, 99, 2000, 2001. Scientology just completely destroyed that thing and ruined Bob Minton, the guy who started it, in the process. Well, Mark Bunker was one of the people who worked there. And he pointed out in my interview with him something that really kind of startled me. It shouldn't have. I knew this already, but it startled me when he said it out loud. And that was that Mike Rinder, who has been one of the most powerful critics of Scientology since coming out in the mid-2000s, working on the show with Leah Remini on Scientology and the Aftermath and publishing a blog that he posts every day and doing numerous other things. So he's clearly now not a Scientologist, not a Sea Org member, has no loyalty to that whatsoever and wants to fight back against that group. There's no question about that. And yet he's the same guy who literally ruined Bob Minton and took out Mark Bunker and all the rest of the LMT. And Mark Bunker today, as a member of the Clearwater City Council, has Mike Rinder as a friend, ally, person he works closely with in his life. And he has completely forgiven him. And it really got me thinking about that and about this idea of redemption and what does it take to accomplish redemption? And what does that even mean? And that sort of thing. So I thought this was a worthy topic to discuss. And that's sort of the framing of it. I have said a few times in questions and answers that there are a small handful of people, literally less than 5 people, who I have a very hard time thinking I could ever forgive for some of the wrongs that they committed against me as a Sea Org member. They were all Sea Org members.
Yeah.
And I maintain that. But now I'm really rethinking that. Because if Mark Bunker, who is a gentleman and a saint and a really, really wonderful man.
Yeah.
If he could forgive Mike Rinder and call him friend now, well, he had things done to him that were far worse than anything that was done to me by these people I'm talking about, not by Scientology in general. I did an
Mm.
RPF program. There ain't nothing like that. But anyway, that's the context in which I'm looking at this. And I thought, what thoughts have you given to about this and the nature of redemption and forgiveness?
A fair amount. Um, it is an essential topic because I have seen people burn themselves up with hatred. Um, Sadly, sometimes towards me. I've been the object of their hatred. There's one person who determined to drive me to suicide by wrecking my relationships all around and doing everything possible to attack me. And this was not a Scientologist. This was an ex-Scientologist who was not an independent, but who had decided that and said that the world would be a much better place if I were dead.
Wow.
Um, that was a very strange situation to be in, which led to many complexities in my life. A number of people who I presumed to be good friends turned against me. Two of them, indeed, wrote affidavits against me, which fortunately I could disprove from documentary evidence. So, that wasn't too worrying. It was very interesting to see the way that um, that feelings were roused, and that people could be brought into this little hate group with me as the focus. And it was very disturbing. It had a couple of very difficult years dealing with it. There were court actions involved. It was most unpleasant. And I had to consider my feeling towards other people. And as we said elsewhere, my trust in other people changed, with a kind of resigned feeling that, I'd understood that you can't keep anything out of court. The only private relationship you actually have in your life is with your lawyer, that anything else can be demanded. So your friends may end up testifying against you because they're under oath, and that's what they're doing. And let me say that in all the years that I was under oath and on the witness stand or involved in proceedings, I never once distorted the truth in any way. And I came to understand that I was pretty much unique in that. As I talk with people, their willingness to corrupt the truth is astonishing. I simply felt that in that situation that my integrity was there, and I have to say, what was real. And there were some close moments, because certainly there was one instance. In fact, one of the people who attacked me, I defended, and I knew something about this person that would have got them into a lot of trouble. And thankfully, I was never asked a question about it on the witness stand. So, but very mixed feelings about how trustworthy people are, that almost anyone can be persuaded to think otherwise about you. They don't need evidence. They just need, as Warren Beatty said, people don't remember what you said. They remember how it made them feel. And I've witnessed that many times, that people will take against me because I've said something that brought up a feeling in them that distressed them. And when I've had the chance to talk about it and be able to say, well, I'm really sorry, but that wasn't what I meant. I didn't know about this situation in your life, and I wasn't suggesting this at all. But often that's the sundering of a relationship, and off the person goes, and they've got this bad feeling. So that leads us to the notion of forgiveness. I am not sure that I have the superior position to be able to forgive other people. That's something that's interested me for a long time, because forgiveness was brought to me as a Christian concept. And it was, well, what right have I got to be to judge people that they need forgiving or not? So that's a kind of abstract thing. So I forgive everybody. You're forgiven. It's done. As long as you don't hurt my children or my cat, obviously. There are
Obviously.
exceptions, or my grandchild, obviously. But for me, forgiveness that's normal. But as we've talked about this before, and I said, I don't forget. I mean, I don't hold it against the person either. But if I know that somebody has has problems with an area, they can't cook very well, I don't ask them to cook for me. It's quite simple. So when you understand people, trust them. We said it when we were talking just before. I trust people as far as I can know them. That the understanding I have of them informs what I will trust them to do. And my relationships, I have very strong relationships going back decades with people that have never suffered any difficulty, because both I and the other person in the relationship take the point of view that we're good people and we would not deliberately hurt each other. So therefore, we don't start reading anything into any subtext into things. So I think we should forgive. But I think there are acts that become, the person has to then redeem themselves by what they do. So, as I have explained long ago to somebody who had deeply offended me, I would be willing to forgive her, but she would have to ask my forgiveness first. She'd have to realize that she needed it. And I think that that's the important part, where somebody realizes they need forgiveness, that we go through, then the contrition, what can I do to make it good, making amends, as L. Ron Hubbard put it on his tone scale right down at the bottom. What a narcissistic idea that is, that you would want to make amends for something harmful you've done. Oh, that means you're very close to death. It's like, okay.
Well, as far as Hubbard was concerned, because he'd rather die than make amends to somebody.
No, that and the no sympathy are two really interesting little points there, that you mustn't have sympathy. Well, where's compassion in that? And that is the point, because it struck me that nobody is unredeemable. When I heard that Hubbard had died, I wept. But not for a long time, I admit, but I did weep, genuinely. I shed a tear, because I had this fancy in my mind, having found out so much about him, having, I think, understood him better than any of his auditors ever understood him, I mean, I think Jerry Armstrong probably understands him better even than I do, having gone through all of that material. And maybe Stacey Young, who also went through much of the archive material, Stacey Minton, in fact. But I understood him and have enough experience with psychology to have had the thought that I wanted to sit down with him and get his biography out of him, debrief him, find out what he'd really done, and bring him to some kind of understanding of what he'd done. But that would be on visits to prison.
Right.
There was no way that a man who had committed such outrages, and I'm sad to say the same is true for me about David Miscavige, they have done truly horrible things to other human beings for which they deserve to be tried, whether in the court of public opinion, or David Miscavige could still be tried in a court of law. And I do believe in redemption. I tend towards the point of view that Ted Bundy probably is irredeemable. But Jeffrey Dahmer struck me as somebody who sort of broke with what the FBI tells us about, or indeed what Robert Hare teaches us about psychopath, in that Dahmer seemed genuinely to feel contrition. He really, at the end, he was doing interviews when he was murdered, sadly, in prison, where he was showing emotion about what he'd done, and where he did not fit this pattern of the without conscience, without remorse. And what's more, unlike, say, Myra Hindley, who she was famous in this country, in Brady and Myra Hindley were the Moors murderers. They captured and tortured small children and then murdered them. And they tape recorded the proceedings. This was back in the 1960s. And while she still thought that she might get out of prison, she kept making up this story about it was all Brady and, I just went along with him and all of this. And then she was told that if they could find any of the missing bodies, that she had a chance of being let out. And suddenly she knew where they were. She'd been part of it. So I think the Myra Hindley characters, she actually sued a friend of mine, Jean Ritchie, who had written a book about her. And Myra Hindley sued this woman for saying these things about her. And the judge said, there's nothing that anybody could say about you that would be a libel, given what you've done. So you're what's called libel proof. And that was the end of that case.
Wow.
So
Wow.
I think there are people who probably aren't redeemable, and that the best we can do is to make sure, that, like Hannibal Lecter, they have to wear the little mask so they can't bite your nose off, that they do have to be confined and restricted. But I also think that the vast, that's what, 2% of the population, maybe less than that, all of the psychopaths are meant to be 2%. I don't know how they get to these numbers. I think they use a Ouija board or something.
I think so too. Yeah.
But I think there are probably a lot more people in our society who are negatively inclined than 2%, and utterly selfish. But I do, if we then look at what's called the narcissistic personality disorder, my friend Kirk Hondo, who's a professor in Seattle, is a clinical psychologist who says he is dealing with people who have this disorder and he is making headway. Our friend Jessica is a little skeptical of this, having also dealt with quite a lot of these people in a clinical situation. But I think there is a possibility of redemption, and what's good for society is that happens. What's good for us as individuals is that we do need to redeem ourselves, all of us. And I think and we've agreed about this before, that's the process of growing up, becoming mature, becoming independent, being self-reliant and self-reliable, and then looking at, how do we get here? How do we go along? The process of living is, for me, a process of redemption. And that ultimately, and it's not, I'm not into flagellation particularly. In fact, anything that hurts, I don't really like. It could just be me. I don't know.
I don't think it's just you.
No, good. It's good to know that. There are two of us at least. So I'm not suggesting that redemption is something that's achieved by beating yourself up at all. I think it's something that's achieved by constantly seeking to be honest with yourself about how you feel. I look at, how I might benefit in a situation from somebody, particularly if I'm in a, occasionally I'll still have a client. There'll be somebody who needs my help, and I will charge them money for giving help, which I never used to do back in the old days. And that's why I'm so poor, I think. But in that situation, I have to look at how am I benefiting, the money I'm taking, and what will I do in return, and who am I? We both know about the nobility of standing up against a terrible group, and how we might regard ourselves. Well, I did it because it satisfied my ego to do it. I'm willing to accept that. It's not because, I am an empath. Sadly, I do test as an empath, but which I regard as a disorder. I don't think it's an advantage in any way, being compelled to help people, who half the time are taking advantage of you. It doesn't really.
Well, that part of it might be a little rough. Yeah, I think the compassion tolerance part's pretty cool, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and absolutely, I think redemption for most of us is developing compassion over empathy, where we seek to do the best in a situation, but we are capable of seeing how somebody might be seeking to exploit us, and nonetheless carrying on. As I've said before, I had many Scientology agents come to me, and I had to treat them the same way I'd treat anybody. I'll answer your questions. And I was very gratified when the investigation aide told me that the problem with running agents against me was that sooner or later they'd come along and say, I can't do this anymore. He's such a nice guy. I had the guy who ran the last mission against me, the one that bankrupted me, Greg Ryerson. He told somebody who went back to Scientology and then came out that I wasn't really a suppressive person. He'd spent this time with me, and he was going to save me in my next lifetime. It's like, thanks, Greg.
Wow, man.
And, but he might look for a little bit of redemption himself. The point, Mike Rinder was also involved in harassing me. of course, because he was involved in harassing everybody. He, I think, to his chagrin, cannot remember what he did to me. Now, as it was going on for 10 years, I am, yeah, there must be a whole area of his life that's just closed down. And I have met that in people who did this before. He's certainly not the only one. I would quite like for him to talk with me about what he'd done. But if he can't remember it, he can't really do that, can he? I would quite like for him to apologize to me, because this did affect my children. My two older children were much affected by living in East Grinstead, where other kids would disconnect from them in the playground, and people would come hammering on my door at 11 o'clock at night, demanding that I explain why I'd persuaded their girlfriend not to talk to them, which of course hadn't happened, or whatever. But my kids went through that. They saw protesters on the street with placards. So whatever part in that Mike Rinder played, it would be nice. But I think he's kind of done so much to help that I've never even thought about forgiving him. That he's redeemed himself with his incredible courage and his determination to tell the truth. Because we had Mark Rathbun, emerge at the same time, who is just a truly awful person. I'm sorry, if he wants to sue me, he can. Selfish, concerned with building his own ego. And again, so what he harmed Miscavige and Scientology by telling some part of the truth. And that's great. That's really good. But I feel Mike Rinder redeemed himself, whereas Mark Rathbun didn't. Mark Rathbun still needs to face his own demons and look at what he did. I'd particularly like him to look at what he did to Jerry Armstrong, because, it was deeply offensive that, having left Scientology, he then carried on this pretense that Jerry had somehow been involved in some devious attempt to undermine Scientology, when what had really happened was that Mark Rathbun and Gene Ingram had got together and got Jerry to say that, yes, he would be able to forge documents, which, Jerry being Jerry and very precise, is true. He would be able. But Jerry being Jerry wouldn't do it, because Jerry, in my long experience of him, going back to 1984, is an extraordinarily ethical human being who really does care about other people and doing things. So I would very much like it if, I presume that Mark Rathbun watches all of your broadcasts. I'd very much like it if he would think about what he's done and apologize to Jerry. That would be great. But, and so yeah, that there you go. I've said a lot about this. What do you have
Well,
to
there
say?
is. Well, while you were talking, of course, many, many things occurred to me. And I think I'll start with redeem, the word. Redemption, right?
Deem
Redeem.
again.
I mean, I hadn't, yeah, exactly, to deem again. And I thought about that and I went, huh. Sometimes there's quite a bit to be realized just in taking apart a word. I mean, maybe that's something that came out of Scientology with, because of all the
It's a
emphasis
good
on the
thing.
words there. Yeah, it's one of those good things.
Yeah.
But to look at again, to evaluate again, right? How you deem a thing, and that requires action. It requires a cause to look again, a reason to reevaluate a thing. And it was interesting looking back in history here, short history of Mike and Marty coming out of Scientology, right? And both at the same time, both did videos together, talked about the times in Scientology, things they had done, things that had happened. Then started kind of separating because it became clear that they were not really on the same page. And that Mark Rathbun moved forward with this lawsuit, and we were all gung ho about it. We all thought he was going to be this torchbearer, and he was doing this great thing. And then and yet the whole time he was doing that, there were these flags, right? There were these red flags of, I reached out to him to offer my assistance with his court case. He just kind of totally brushed me off. Other people as well, I heard the same thing from. You try to have a conversation with him, it wouldn't go anywhere. Um, I met him at I met him when I was in Scientology, but I met him for the first time coming out. at the Going Clear premiere down in Austin, Texas, and went down there to see it. And he was there, and I was like, "Oh, hey," and I sort of talked to him very, very briefly after the show, and he was like, "Yeah, email me, call me, or whatever." And I tried, nope, nothing. And then shortly thereafter, he's pulling the case, and the whole thing fell apart. And then he's trashing me, trashing everybody, and disappears. And you go, huh? I stood up for the guy. I was willing to give him some degree of redemption, I suppose you could say, in my mind. I stood up for him on social media because of his actions. And then, of course, the character comes through because it always does. You can't really suppress that kind of thing for very long. Mike, on the other hand, has been the exact opposite road. And he's held steady and true to his mission and his course. So our assessment of him is very, very different. He's consistently a different person now. Marty sort of tried to ride a wave of enthusiasm and popularity because of what he was doing to stick it to Miscavige, but he never really did change from the person he was when he was in Scientology, which was basically an asshole. I mean, I met him when I was in, he was an asshole. I met him when he was out, he was an asshole. So that's just, I don't say that the world would be a better place if he was dead, or some nonsense like that. I'm just saying the guy's hard to get along with. So there was no real effort made on his part to acknowledge and deal directly and responsibly and maturely with the actions he had participated in and taken and caused on his own as a Sea Org member, as the second highest ranking Sea Org member, on the planet. So it was their redemption for Marty Rathbun. I think pretty clearly the answer is no. Has there been redemption for Mike? Absolutely. Has there been for me? I think so. I've not thought of my path as one of redemption.
No.
You know, um, I've thought of my path in terms of making up for some of what I did.
Mm.
Um,
Which I
I
guess
think.
I guess is redemption, really.
Well, I'm realizing right now, or I'm sort of thinking through this right now, that redemption is something other people. It's evaluation from others. I mean, suppose you could redeem yourself, but that doesn't really count a whole lot if everybody else thinks you're an asshole. So there is a group activity here. I think, on the other hand, to contrast this a little bit, or at least how the thoughts that are on my mind about it are, I think forgiveness is the personal thing. I
Mm,
think forgiving yourself, I think forgiving other people is something you do for yourself
mm,
as opposed to for the other person. It's great if you can have the opportunity to be with the other person, tell the other person you forgive them.
mm,
Maybe that will have some impact on them towards their redemption.
mm.
But I think for me, forgiveness is a process of letting go
Yeah.
of anger, hate, the feelings of revenge.
Mm,
Forgiveness is a clear cut mark in time or line in the sand of, okay, I no longer feel vengeful toward you.
mm,
You know, I think it's a necessary step it certainly has been for me.
mm.
And when I look at that Mark Bunker example, it really made me rethink, why am I holding on to these grudges against people I haven't seen or talked to in 8 years,
Mm.
um, that don't care about me, that never cared about me?
Mm.
Why do I still give them any real estate in my head? And thinking about it that way, and thinking about what they did to me, the harsh words, the pushing around, the punishments, the certainly no shortage of yelling and screaming, but real physical stuff too. I mean,
Yeah.
the being up all night washing dishes and shit like that because of orders I would get from some of these people. Um, the humiliation that would occur as a result of this. The public humiliation. A couple of these people who had been holding on to, had said and done things, when others were around, very, very, very clearly to humiliate me while I was leaving the Sea Org, for example, things like that. So you hold on to those things. You're like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to forgive this if that person even the full statement was if that person came out of Scientology, saw the error of their ways, would you be able to forgive them? And I was like, I don't know, man. Couple people, I don't know, but clearly these two things have to go hand in hand, redemption and forgiveness, because I don't think forgiveness is meaningful to the other person if they haven't earned it in some fashion. I do get how you can give forgiveness without having to interact with the person or without them having to do anything, just to let it go. And you go, okay, I'm going to let this go. I'm going to push this off. But there is still a factor of, are they really redeemed?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a little.
they,
I guess it depends on how you want to frame this picture a little bit, I guess. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
and I think forgiveness is a natural outcome. It's not, and when somebody tries to force somebody else to forgive because it'll be good for them. I had a friend who was abandoned into an orphanage by his own father at the age of 8. And by his father, he was declared an orphan. And he was treated horribly there. The father knew this would happen because it was the orphanage he'd grown up in.
Ugh.
And this man has he's lived a good and decent life. He's done what he can to help people. He was a peace campaigner. He's done a lot to help people. But one day, while he was still vaguely of the Christian persuasion, an Anglican priest said to him, "You have to forgive your father." His father had died by this time. "You have to forgive him." And it upset him. And he came to me, thankfully, and I said, I think that's just utterly wrong. Nobody has the right to tell you who you ought to forgive, and that, there's something wrong with you if you're not doing it. If I'd been through Auschwitz, I probably wouldn't have taken Viktor Frankl's charitable view of what I'd seen in there. Some things are probably unforgivable. And my redemption doesn't depend upon me forgiving people for doing horrific things. That is not part of it. My redemption comes for me acknowledging what I've done that's wrong and accepting that. And perhaps letting go of hatred while retaining righteous indignation. And that's a very difficult one to differentiate.
Big time. I really couldn't agree with you more about that. You can never ever force a forgiveness in order for it to mean anything. It must come from the person wholly and completely, or it is just useless, because it's as we're contextualizing it and defining it, it is something the person is giving of their own free will,
Yeah.
that they then get to unburden themselves of this burden of bad, ill feeling and weight and despair and, excuse me, all these awful things that we carry around with us when we've been harmed by others.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think it can be forced at all. And I think it's a huge mistake of organized religion or people involved in that to force that on children, force that on anyone at all, of any age, really. Um, so that's for sure. And redemption is something that does need to be earned. It's not just something that you should just receive just because you're a human being or something, or because, well, isn't that a good demonstration of compassion and tolerance? No, not necessarily. Not if the person hasn't done something to show that they deserve a new look,
Yeah.
a new valuation. So,
I mean, I'll give a specific example. In around about 1955, there was a former SS man who publicly talked about, I think he was involved with the gas wagons where they used carbon monoxide to kill people. And he knew that by making this confession, he could possibly go to prison for the rest of his life. But he had come to the point where he felt for his own sake, that he must say, I witnessed this and it was wrong. As it was, he was not prosecuted. And, he is one of the many witnesses, about 200,000, to these events, which some people deny ever happened. But there you have a tremendous courage. But also, it's the center of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's astonishing novel, where this student, Raskolnikov, poor student, decides he can kill the miserly old landlady and take her money. And the book is about him trying to deal with his conscience after I've spoiled it now, haven't I? So that's another story.
You spoiled Crime and Punishment for everybody.
And then Batman comes in, and
right.
But the normal, decent human being will be burdened by conscience if they've done something wrong. A lot of the problem is how wrong and right are reframed. As L. Ron Hubbard said, goodness and badness, beautifulness and ugliness are alike considerations and have no other basis than opinion. So as far as L. Ron Hubbard, good and evil don't exist. Morality, there is no such thing. It's just ethics, which is the narcissistic idea of, does it help my survival? That's
exactly.
Not a very good system all in all. I think that determining what is good and evil, and often leaving an authoritarian group, a cult group, a destructive cult group, an abusive group, an abusive relationship, you are faced with the reality that your schema of good and evil was completely wrong. That murdering all the Jews wasn't actually going to help humanity in any way at all. And so people can come away, and then it can be very difficult, I think, for Mark Rathbun. And I've tried to read Memoirs of a Scientology Warrior, his first book. And I think it was the first book written by a Scientologist that I failed to finish. So I must have had a misunderstood word. Maybe it was the word warrior. But what I was reading was the autobiography of a narcissist, right from the start. It was this guy who'd got this big idea about himself, that although he was only a class 4 auditor or something, and yet he conceived himself as the head of the new Scientology. He was going to be the next L. Ron Hubbard. And it was sort of, just take a look in the mirror, guy. We're people. And no, you don't have special knowledge. I was particularly insulted that he started talking about Lao Tzu and talking about Taoism, when he obviously had not the slightest understanding of what it means. And that then he appears to have been bought off, that the court case went away. But, it might well be that he has a monthly salary, because that's the way, little David worked it out, that you don't give people a chunk of change and then hope you give them a salary. And I think the threat that was made clear in Louis Theroux's My Louis Theroux movie, where he's faced, and it said to him near the end of it by the Scientologist cameraman, is this getting you your nut? And how are things with the kid? And that video went straight back 6 months before Louis Theroux issued the thing, and they realized that they'd found the weak point. All we have to do is make one nasty report and your adopted child will be taken away from you. And so his wife dropped her case with no explanation. But I am speculating.
Clearly. Pure speculation, Jon. Unfounded. Unbelievable. I can't believe.
But he would have to have some recognition, some point of saying that the system of ethics that he had subscribed to, which meant that people like you and me were fair game, who could be tricked, who could be lied to, who could be destroyed, could be sued, could be destroyed, that was ethically proper. That he believed that, and he never, as far as I can see, ever came away from that. He just changed who the enemy was. And you are still dealing with them in the same way. Well, the road to Damascus, for any of us, there could be that realization that the schema of ethics that we've believed in is wrong, that racism, gender apartheid, all sorts of things that people become involved in, white nationalism, these neo-Nazism, all of these strange permutations which are anti some other part of the human race. and is suggesting that there is some difference between humans, so that some part of us should be persecuted. Maybe Mike needs to think about that too. And, I'd certainly be very happy to talk with him about that, as somebody objectively, rather than, so I'm not concerned about anything he might have done to me. But, maybe he has talked about it. Maybe he's called Rachel Bernstein up and worked all that stuff out. I don't know. But I think we all do need to, keep the accounts. And, it's not, am I going to go to heaven because I've been a good boy? It's, is it good to have a clear conscience? I had only one thing on my conscience from 9 years in Scientology, because I was not on the staff. I didn't have to bully anybody, and I wasn't bullied, except for them trying to bully money out of me, which I didn't have anyway, so that wasn't too bad. But one thing happened. I employed a former L. Ron Hubbard aide to work in my little art promotion business down in East Grinstead. And one day I came in, and during that week, my first wife, had failed to sell a painting. She hadn't sold anything that week. And he was in a tiny little, what we call a box room. It's a bedroom that's too small to be a bedroom, basically, that appended onto houses in this country for reasons nobody understands. Because we don't keep boxes in them either, it's mad. But we'd got it set up as an office, and he was in there sort of 2 inches away from us, screaming his head off at her. Now, I'd never witnessed a severe reality adjustment. It was during my last year in Scientology, and it took me 3 days to sit him down and say, what were you doing? Where's it written that you do that? If it isn't written, it isn't true. And he said, it's not written. And then he started weeping, put his head in his hands, and said, Hubbard did it to us. And, my move away from Scientology, that really meant something to me, that there was this guy who shouted at people to demean and diminish and traumatize them. And that could not be the leader of a positive group. It could not be. That would never be the behavior of a decent and evolved human being. So for years afterwards, I carried this thing that I had not stepped in and stopped him from doing this. Then about 5 years ago, I had a conversation with my ex-wife and said, this is something that really bothered me. And she said, oh, I don't remember that. So redemption may come from, different places. How much effect something had on somebody. Yeah.
True that. Good point. I think another aspect of this that I'm sort of thinking about that I wanted to bring up was the knowledge aspect of this, or maybe that fits. This fits under the empathy or part two, which is where I find it a lot easier to get into a forgiving frame of mind or move in that direction when I can understand what's driving a person.
Yes.
Probably the best example of this, the most clear cut, black and white example that when I present it to people, they just go, oh, really? Is Charles Whitman, the Texas Tower shooter. Right back in the, I think it was the 60s. He went up there and shot a whole bunch of people with a rifle and murdered like lots of kids. And they had to go up there and take him out, and it was bad. And he was a sharpshooter. He knew what he was doing, and he had he had guns up there. He had ammo. He came prepared. And you go, my God, the serial killer, mass shooter, one of the first that we know of on record, sort of thing. Why, how could this be? And then you find out, years after the fact, of course, because at the time they had apparently no way of really figuring this out, or he hadn't figured it out. They had to kind of investigate the whole thing based on his journals and stuff to find out. Oh, and an autopsy that he had a tumor in his head the size of a golf ball. Yeah. And it had been driving him to violence, and he'd been inclined to violence already. Let's not go too far off the beam here. He was a violent guy. He had tendencies in that direction. And then as the years progressed, you go through his journals and stuff, and you see that it got worse and worse. And he literally not figuratively, not kind of like with a little bit of, oh, gee, it's no, he really couldn't stop himself.
Yeah.
You could see the sort of descent into madness through the time. And you learn that about him, and it does not in any way, shape, or form take away from the evil of the act. But when you understand that he really didn't have a whole lot of choice in the matter based on everything we understand about the brain and tumors and behavior and all of that. I mean, if we're really going to be honest about it, he didn't, he was driven to that by forces that were completely out of his control. And once you learn that, you go, huh, that's, it's very difficult to still hold on to anger, hate towards him. You just go, oh man, you kind of pity, is more the thing that comes to mind. And at the same time, without in any way reducing the evil of the act he committed, or the fact that he did commit it, or the fact that had he lived, had they not had to kill him, they absolutely could have, should have, and would have removed him from society.
And removed the tumor from his head.
Exactly. And then what we find with other cases on record is that, like certain pedophiles, for example,
Mm,
is that also brain tumors have been found
mm,
to cause that kind of aberrant behavior. And then when they're removed, the desire for that behavior completely disappears.
mm,
And you go, huh. So are we dealing with a moral problem or are we dealing with a physiological problem? Right? That
mm.
becomes a moral problem,
And this
becomes
is
a societal problem, you know?
it's set into a culture that in our legal systems throughout the Western world, you have these archaic Latin terms, mens rea, actus reus. Mens rea is the intention to commit the act, the mental part of it, and actus reus is the fact of having committed the act. And that if somebody is judged incompetent in mentally, then they did not commit a crime. And this gets really fascinating when you look at particular cases. Is it Peter, I think, Sutcliffe, who's called the Yorkshire Ripper in this country, who I think murdered 7 women. And he took a plea of insanity, and the decision, I think the judge was very sensible. I think, you have this criminal insanity is the possibility that the judge can go for. And so he basically said he needs to be locked up forever. But of course, the idea is if he's insane, that if he ceases to be insane, then the law is challenged. And he did cease to be insane. A couple of years ago, it was determined that he's no longer insane. And the poor man, quite deservedly, was then sent to prison, because we ain't going to let you out. We don't care what he said. But I've long felt that we should judge by the act, find the person guilty or not of the act, and then bring in mitigation to make milder the circumstances of that particular person. And I think with anybody, say Hitler's quite interesting. People have written about his rotten childhood. Stalin didn't have a very nice childhood either. And originally, when the term sociopath and psychopath were being used, when Robert Hare wrote about it in the early 90s in Without Conscience, the great expert on the subject, he said, well, these words mean a psychopath means that you think that it's the individual's responsibility that they are the way they are. And a sociopath just means exactly the same thing, but you think society, it was the situation that drove them to it. He revised that, and his more recent definition is that a psychopath is the hardcore end of the scale, and a sociopath is a lesser form of psychopath. But it was very much the argument, were psychopaths being created by society? Well, I'd say let's start with the act. Let's start with what they did and what we must do to make sure that they don't do it again, whether they are held responsible or not. There's a very easy argument with Ron Hubbard to say that he suffered a parental neglect. His mother was unloving. His father was away. He grew up in a domineering grandfather's household. I don't believe the tales about sexual abuse that people have fabricated, because none of the material that I've seen about his childhood would lead me in that direction. I had somebody try to persuade me that Commander Thompson must have, had sexual relationship. And it was like, well, his relationship with Commander Thompson, as best Russell Miller and I could work out, lasted about 3 days, and it was on a boat going through the Panama Canal. There is no note of them ever spending time together again, and why we should presume that Commander Thompson, who has nothing else to blemish his record, unless you think the study of snakes is a bad thing, why he should be, because it's a personality trait in Hubbard that must have come from this place. Well, no, I don't think so. I think Hubbard, we could justify everything he did. We could say he had temporal lobe epilepsy, as Yuval Laor, I think, has pretty well demonstrated. I went through all 18 traits of the Befodeo thing, and I found 17 of them straight away that Hubbard had. Hypergraphia, can't stop writing. Come on, Guinness Book of World Records says he's the most prolific author of all time.
Yeah, Yuval and I went over it on this very podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, and I went through all the traits. I mean, it was pretty clear that, there's a very strong case to be made for that.
Yeah, I mean, and after that, Yuval was contacted by a guy who'd been an Ivy League professor of neurology, who'd actually been there on the day that temporal lobe epilepsy was first announced in the 1970s. And he happened to have had as a hobby, which he'd never talked to anyone about, weird hobby, collecting material about Ron Hubbard and Scientology. As an outsider, he was just fascinated by them. And he contacted Yuval and he said, you're right, I'd never thought about it.
Oh my God, that is
we had a neurologist who, knew that. But so he could say that, but we also have to say, well, he seemed to be bipolar. We'd also have to say he was paranoid. There are all of these things going on. But the thing we can also say about Ron Hubbard is that from his teens, he was solipsistic. He was totally self-involved. There is no concern for any other human being in the 3 famous diaries that Scientology put into the Armstrong case and then were given to me and I released to the world. Thank you very much for doing that, David Miscavige, because it showed us what he was saying when he was a teenager, unblemished by anybody's opinion, and that he was, you can see he's a kid, doesn't care about anybody but himself. Doesn't have a nice word to say. He's putting down everybody as he goes along. And he grew into an adult who was the same way. Is that the fault of society? Is it the fault of his parents? Is it the fault of his brain? I say start with the act. Start with what was done. Then if there's some way we can redeem this person, and we're talking about redemption here, there's some way we can redeem this person, let's do that. I would rather that if we're going to let people out of prison, that they have been rehabilitated than that they have been tormented, tortured, and trained in the arts of crime so that they're more dangerous than they were when they went in. I would also say that you lock the door and throw away the key with some people because they've killed too many people, or they've, it doesn't matter what they do, they can be, Burt Lancaster in The Birdman of Alcatraz or what have you. That's great, and they can do something wonderful and great from their prison cell, but I wouldn't let them out again. Whether it was, whatever the cause was, unless maybe it was a brain tumor, because then once you've removed it, you are actually dealing with a different person. So you might give them a little more time to see how they settled down. But
that's right. And those kind of mitigating factors, or I don't even want to use the word mitigating. I just want to say those kind of factors, those kind of things are things that we, rarely seem to, obviously emotionally, when you're in the heat of the moment, nobody takes any of this stuff into account. And that's totally understandable in the shock and awe of a horrible event. If the first thing you're thinking of is how can I redeem this person, there's probably, maybe not completely the appropriate thought to be having at that moment.
No.
However, a human beings being who they are, and us going through our little cycles of emotion that we go through, calmer heads must prevail. And we must, after the initial shock of everything, you have to really kind of sit and look at the whole picture. And the whole picture does include societal elements. It includes personal elements. It includes education. Things that we all acknowledge now are completely out of anybody's control from years 0 through 13. I don't know. At what point are you actually able in modern society, Western society I'm talking about now? I cannot speak intelligently about life growing up in, India or Indonesia or something, or Africa. I've never been there. I don't know what the cultures are like there, but I do know in Western culture, there's no pushing back. I mean, you are a cog on a wheel in a system, and depending on where you're born, depending on the socioeconomic situation that you're born into, what school you go to, what your skin color is, what your culture is, these things are going to have overwhelming effects on who you end up being, and you were never consulted on one of those things. You
It's
just
surprising that most violent crimes are committed by men who have the advantage in such situations. Think the women would be a lot more pissed off about it.
Yeah, you'd think, right? So it's not a matter of like I'm not trying to approach redemption or forgiveness from the point of view of how can we make a person not responsible for their actions.
No,
Under any circumstances, I
quite
believe
the
we are
opposite.
always responsible for our actions.
Yeah,
We committed them.
yeah,
Wasn't somebody else who did it, you know? Um, but you then look at, well, yeah, but why?
mm,
Why?
yeah.
And was it a moral reason? Was it an ethical reason, or was it some off the rails antisocial, anti-society? You're a round peg in a square hole here, and we got to kind of separate you from the herd and figure out what to do with you kind of a reason.
Mm.
That's the kind of thing I think we could spend a lot more time looking at. I think our legal system needs a whole lot of revision based on what we're learning now about people and why and how they act versus you know the old Latin and it's sort of, I mean, our legal system is kind of at best 17th 18th century
Mm.
in philosophy, while we have moved on through an enlightenment, and we are now developing real social sciences, and yeah, they are in their infancy, they're baby steps, there's so much we don't get, but the little bit we do get, we should start using that, and
Absolutely.
and I think we can build a better society if we could do that. If we could look at prisons, I mean, this is a whole nother discussion. I'm only going to skirt around this one, but if we could look at prisons as, not places where it's an eye for an eye, is the philosophy driving prison,
Mm,
which is how it is now, and it's certainly in the United States,
mm.
if not just outright slave trade.
Yeah, it is.
Instead, if we could look at them more on what I think some European models of real rehabilitation, but this isn't particularly a conversation about rehabilitation. It's more about redemption. And these
Mm,
things are obviously hand in hand, but they are different. So,
yes, it's true.
yeah,
And
it's a deep subject, huh?
it is. And certainly, the legal system, having had far too much to do with it. I consulted to a lot of cases over the years, about 150. And I came to a fairly pessimistic view that every now and then you would have somebody like Justice Breckenridge in the first Armstrong case, or
Yep.
Mr. Justice Leahy, who a month later decided to take a family case public and rule, which is, I think, was unprecedented. I don't think it had ever happened because they have no precedental value. They're not publicly shared, and gave a 54-page ruling in open court. And what they both showed, the Casey Hill case in Canada as well, which doesn't seem to have been much talked about, where a judge won a case for libel in, I think, 1993. You have very intelligent discussions, some of the IRS rulings, very intelligent discussions about what's happened and what Scientology is and how it might be seen. But quite often you'll find a judge choking on some little technical point, at the end of the Tichborne Christopherson case, that poor woman.
Perfect example, by the
Yeah,
way, because
the,
talk
the,
about the stupidest technicality.
yeah, the judge decides that her lawyer shouldn't have been able to instruct the jury that Scientology was not a religion, even though it actually had no religious status at that time. in the US, and that he was therefore reversing. And I think it was the third time the trial had been heard. And this poor woman thought she was going to get her, $35 million at last, and got diddly squat
That's right.
after such effort. And, we also lost all of the transcripts. Only the Howard Schomer testimony was available from that case, which was a remarkable piece of testimony, by the way, Homer Schomer's testimony there. But so we lost everything because a judge chickened out. Then you hear about judges who had to recuse themselves because their dog was drowned, and Scientology admitted they'd done it. That was Ritchie, I think, did that. All of these things that show you how you can mess with the legal system because of a certain corruption that is part of that system. And I personally would say that part of that is the incredible amount of money that is to be made by doing something that is actually really not that complicated, and that it's still adversarial. There's still the idea of, you have your champion, I have my champion, and they do battle. So I was involved in a case where a young man had basically tried to kidnap a woman. He'd inflicted damage, only a scratch perhaps, but with a penknife on this poor guy. He'd had a big dog, all of this. He'd confessed everything. And here he was in court. The barrister, and here a barrister means a trial attorney, that they solicitors prepare cases. So the barristers are the big guys. He'd never met the guy. He came in on the first morning of the trial and ordered him to take his waistcoat off because this lad had put on a fancy waistcoat thinking that would impress the judge perhaps. And then basically spent most of his time out of court, in the breaks with me, without the solicitor, asking me for things that were basically ridiculous about Scientology. So he asked the witnesses, so you've signed a billion-year contract. Is that 1,000 million or 1,000,000 years? And he made them look ridiculous. The young man didn't go on the witness stand because he had previous, he had convictions already. And he would later, he settled a civil suit with Scientology where he completely admitted he'd done it. But it took the jury only 7 minutes to decide unanimously that he was not guilty. So seeing the way that a lawyer can lead a jury to a conclusion, which is, I came away from that, I needed a little bit of redemption for myself, going, well, I was hired and paid to provide information. It wasn't up to me how the argument was made, but I still feel it's wrong that he got away with this, and he didn't get away with it. In the end, he had to admit it in a civil suit and make a statement, but he got away lightly, let's say, compared to what may have happened to him otherwise. And the law is an ass, as has been said.
Basically, yeah. And that's probably something worthy of another episode or two, actually, because the undue influence and coercive control that occurs in interrogations, much less when you're leading a jury down a fanciful road. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. But let's go ahead and pull back from that for a second, because I want to get back onto the main line and sort of wrap this up. And I think that we've made some very good points here. I think the thing I wanted to ask you about last on this, and getting right back onto forgiveness and redemption, is, are these things, I posited earlier, well, forgiveness is about, for me, it's about me and letting go and that. And certainly I agree with you that, forgetting is not part of that process. Forgive is forgive. It's not forgive and forget. I don't forget either. But are these things really how we find closure, or, are there other ways that we might go about doing that? Or is this pretty much it?
Well,
I mean, can you let it go without having to forgive the person?
Yeah, I think you probably can. I mean, there was a survey done of former inmates of concentration camps in the 1970s, late 1970s. And it was found that with or without any kind of treatment or counseling, these people had many of them come to terms with what happened to them and moved on. That the post-traumatic stress had gone. It was, of course, something that would always be with them. I mean, there is a famous case. There was a guy who was in Dachau who actually moved. He came from Dachau and he moved back into his house. And people said, how can you possibly live here? And he said, well, I've always lived here. What are you talking about? So people have different levels of resilience. There's the need to let go of what's been done to you and say, that's not the most important thing in my life anymore. You know, there are relationships I can have. There are things that I can do with my life which are positive. And there's the need on the other side of the person who's done something bad to be redeemed, and that can be a different thing. That person may need to explain what they've done, confess to what they've done, and they may need to seek the forgiveness of people they've harmed before they can feel reconciled. And that's probably a positive drive where it occurs.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. I think, like with all things, it's probably pretty individual for each of us, and
Mm,
obviously context specific.
very much so, yes.
Yeah. Boy, wouldn't the world be a better place if all those big broad generalities were actually true all the time?
Yeah, it's so
Be a lot
wonderful.
simpler.
We could impose order on the whole universe and
Yes, a
make it
new
do what we
world
want.
order.
Uh, brave new world order.
That's right. That's right. Well, John, I just wanted to contemplate some of these ideas for a bit and bounce the ball back and forth a bit. You've been wonderful with this. Thank you very
Thank you.
much for contributing your time and attention to this issue. I think this is important for a lot of reasons and at a lot of levels and at different places along the recovery path for people as they come out of these high control groups or destructive relationships or any kind of real situation of abuse. So I hope that maybe some of these ideas have given some reason for thought or some food for thought here. I don't know. Any final words?
No, I don't think so. Beyond the idea that for me, redemption has been a very significant idea through most of my adult life, and that in looking at other people, I hope for their redemption. I hope that they can come to terms with what they've done. I hope that when Mark Rathbun watches this, that they can admit what they've done to themselves. And I think no matter how bad somebody's offences against humanity have been, that if they can take a positive, rather than saying, "Oh, there's nothing of me, I should just kill myself," that it is possible to take any experience we've had and help people with it. So, for example, there's a book, I think it's called Confessions of a Sociopath, by this woman. It's a horrible book. I didn't manage to finish it because, but she is so open about how she feels about things. She couldn't care less. And she will actually cause harm because it amuses her. And so there's a sort of courage there in sharing this with us so that we can better understand.
Yeah.
And maybe a little slice of redemption for her there. But who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Well, interesting subject. Very,
Yes.
very interesting subject. There's just a lot to think about with this one on both sides, on the forgiver and the forgivee. And we tend to stress one side of that equation. I wanted to put some look at the other side, at the forgiver,
Hmm.
rather than the guy who's done all the bad stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, interesting. All right, man. Well, I would like to hear from you guys out there too. Any questions, comments, or feedback on this? Good, bad, sideways, agree, disagree. Let us know. Let us know what you think. We'll take a look at it. And just like I always kind of ask, and as you guys have been really wonderful. Actually, since I started asking this has really changed the tenor of a lot of the comments on my channel. Please just don't be insulting in your comments. If you're going to comment on the show, you got some feedback for us. I want to know, but I don't want to be insulted in the process. So, so please be respectful. All right. That
But
having been said,
however,
yeah.
If you are a grandiose narcissist and you want to boast about your having a much better understanding of these issues than we do, we would love to hear from you, and we'll pillory and ridicule you in response. So don't hold back, you know.
Perfect. Perfect. All right, guys. Also, I just want to put a little plug in here. I am not, I'll probably talk about this elsewhere somewhere, but just to throw this in a podcast, I'm not going to turn channel memberships on as a method of support for my channel. YouTube ad revenue is kind of crashing right now for everybody because of the COVID-19 situation. This is going to be a long term situation. So if you are enjoying what I'm doing here on this channel and with this podcast and my content, please do seriously consider supporting me through Patreon. The link is below in the description section of every one of my videos. And it is the thing that keeps these lights on and this little soundboard going and this mic on and everything else, and allows me to keep talking to you guys. So check that out. And that all being said, I will see you guys next week. Thanks for coming around. Bye bye.